two rival pictures of potential ways of being a king, the Saul way or the David way, and we see how the Lord thinks authority should be used. So I find it a really beautiful picture. And as Christians, our fate is bound up with the fate of our king. We have a king who defeats our enemies. We have a king who is blessed, and in him we are blessed. And so we start to see this, the king and his people relationship.
Hello, welcome to the Bible OverBrew. It's great to be back with you. My name is Rachel Redeemed, and we have Matt Sells with us, and we are going to be getting in to the book of 1 Samuel today. It is going to be key chapters 1 to 3 and 16 and 17. First things first, Matt, do you have an appropriate brew?
Got my brew, got my Bible. Do you know what? This is one of the ones I look forward to, all of God's word, but this is one of the ones I've been looking forward to getting into 1 Samuel. These great stories of David. So I'm primed and ready. Have you got an appropriate beverage with you, Rachel?
Yes, I do. I toyed again with the last episode's rooibos. I did enjoy that, but I've gone cranberry and raspberry. Are you back to your builders? That's the question.
Yeah, back to builders. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
We'll see how we get on.
Serving me well.
Fabulous. So we must hear the story so far, and I would love to hear it from your perspective. Hit us,
folks. I thought last episode Rachel did a brilliant story so far. So do go and snag the last episode. I thought it was such a great overview of the Pentateuch, and the story so far today, in a sense, covering the same ground, but we're coming to the books of Samuel where kingship is coming into view. So we're going to have a sort of a story so far, but with a sort of a focus on kingship, because actually there've been hints so far. Though a king first appears in 1 Samuel, we've had hints so far. So we have creation, God creating this beautiful world for Adam and Eve to live in. They're placed in this paradise garden, but they're given a role in the garden, but also to fill the earth and subdue it, to rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air, and this wonderful place of relationship with God, but also rule or dominion over the creatures. And so actually Adam and Eve, but initially Adam, has something of a kingly role, to rule the earth, not in place of God, but under God, for God's glory. Actually, that's part of what it meant to be in God's image, was to be like God and to represent him to the world. And so I think that's important, again, because actually right from God's creation plans, something of kingship and rule is in there. And as I think possibly mentioned way back when we were in the first episode, to understand more of Jesus, actually, if we can understand creation, we'll get to know Jesus better. So Adam having this role to rule, but in a good way, a rule that was good and would bring blessing and to bring fruitfulness. And of course, we then know that sin led to Adam and Eve being cast out of the garden, sent out to the east. But amazingly, still with something of this role of being fruitful and multiplying. We trace that through Genesis. End up in slaves in Egypt. The Exodus, they were rescued out of Egypt, brought to God, brought to his holy mountain, shown how to live, sacrifices given so they can live with a holy God. And really that journey out of Egypt, up from Egypt, we saw Egypt as the grave. They were down in Egypt. They were sort of resurrected out of Egypt, brought up out of Egypt and into the promised land, ultimately. I mean, through Numbers and the grumblers, wanderings in the wilderness, Deuteronomy, the second giving of the law, but eventually Joshua into the promised land, another passing through water moment, God bringing his people through judgment, which is often what the water and sea would symbolize, through judgment into the land, which is something of a new Eden. And we said, well, it looks like the story could end there and they all live happily ever after. But it didn't, because actually what happened was, just as in the first Eden, people sinned, and the book of Judges that we looked at last episode, I found it a really hard episode to do, just to spend that long in such wickedness and sin, and sin not being some fun little misdemeanor, but actually people being hurt, God being dishonored, really tragic. And so Judges finishes with, in those days, there was no king in Israel. People did what was right in their own eyes. And so we see that the people are now back in this kind of Eden type land. But actually, the problem isn't just the enemies out there, but their hearts. The same problem as in the garden right at the start. But we've had hints that kings are going to come. Adam had a kingly role. In Genesis, is it 15 or 17? Abraham is told kings will come from you. The blessings at the end of Genesis, Judah, there's blessings on all of the sons of Israel, and Judah and his family, his tribe, they're told you're the tribe that kings are going to come from. And then in Deuteronomy, there's a law about the king. When you have a king, the king is not to think he's better than his brothers, but is to be something of a servant. So we've had all these hints, which is really important, because when we get to Samuel, actually the reason the people get a king from their point of view is a pretty bad one. They want a king to be like the nations. But actually in God's plan, a king was always on the agenda. Not just to defend from the enemies out there, but also to lead the people in obedience. And so a king will be part of how he brings the people back into Eden in a way that they won't be cast out again. So lots in there. But we've had this story of God's people being brought back into relationship with him. And a king is going to be, as we'll see in 1:7, a king is going to be a crucial part of really whether the people succeed in that or not.
Cool stuff. Well, I'm hyped, so this is going to be great. If folks are joining in, thebibleoverbrew.com has had some questions and steers to help keep the overbrew of some passages that have, as in this one, a lot of detail. And I know for myself, when I've previously studied this book or kind of done it in church or looked at it myself, it's just you're kind of there going, now who's this and what's happening and are these guys good or not? So we will attempt to pink post-it note you through, which is kind of flagging up who's the ones we need to be paying attention to. That might have also raised a couple of questions that we have skipped the book of Ruth. What's going on?
We've skipped the book of Ruth. Yes, we're not anti the book of Ruth. We are reading in there's basically two orderings of the Bible. The Hebrew Bible order, which is actually the order Jesus would have read the Bible, and then what became the English order via the Greek translation. And there's no sort of one that is the only way. Pretty much all our English translations follow what was the first English ordering of the Bible. I think there's good reasons to read it this way. Pretty much every time I've done the Bible in a year, I've done it the English order way, because that's the way my Bible works. But there's a couple of reasons. Firstly, when Jesus read the Old Testament, he read the law, the prophets, and the writings, or the law, the prophets, and the Psalms, which is that Hebrew ordering. So we're reading the Old Testament in the order Jesus would have read it. I think there's something lovely about that. I actually think for reading big chunks, it helps as well. Our English order kind of groups like with like a bit and puts all the history books together. But it means that you go through from sort of Joshua, Judges, 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, 1 Kings, 2 Kings, all the history. And then you get to 1 and 2 Chronicles, where you go back to the beginning and do it all again. To read that straight afterwards, I think is a bit confusing, and we might think a bit redundant maybe. The Hebrew Bible will have Chronicles at the very end of the Old Testament as a kind of a recap of everything that's come so far. So I think to go through the history again a second time, but right at the end, that makes a lot of sense. So it's absolutely not to discourage people if they're reading in the English Bible order. Most of the time, that's what I do. I think for reading big chunks like this, there's something about doing it in the Hebrew Bible order. And there's odd little books like Ruth that actually jumps quite a long way in the two orders. So no great stress with that. But that's what we're doing. And I hope it just gives us, whatever order we read the Bible in, will just give us a different window onto the glories of God's word. Whichever order we read, we'll still learn of the Lord, we'll still be pointed to Christ.
A chance to have a different emphasis. There might be things that we see this time that we wouldn't have seen depending on what you read when, or what you've just read will impact it, I suppose. So just a nice thing to mix it up if folks aren't familiar with that. But let us jump in to our first set of key chapters 1 to 3, where we have the birth of Samuel. So he is going to be our prophet that we're going to have our eye on through the book named after him. But he's born to a lady called Hannah. She is one of 2 wives of a guy called Elkanah, who is a bit of a mixed chap perhaps, but Peninnah is quite mean to Hannah because she's got no children and Peninnah's got loads of kids, and they keep going up year after year to go to worship. And when they're there, Hannah is crying out to the Lord, and she's desperate for a child, and she prays, but almost, you could imagine her, maybe you're familiar with the Harry Potter moment where Snape is caught muttering at a Quidditch match. I think it's in the Philosopher's Stone or the Sorcerer's Stone for American friends. And you assume ill intent. Eli is a priest who sees her and he thinks she's drunk because she's just muttering away. And he's quite harsh to her. You know, what are you doing having been drinking too much wine? And she explains herself, and then he kind of says, you know, go in peace. And he hopes that the Lord will give her prayer for a child. And the Lord answers her prayer, and he gives her a son. She offers him back to the Lord. We then get her praising God with Hannah's prayer or Hannah's song in chapter 2, and this is really cool. There's this whole pile of like reversals going on in this little section. It kind of is like the theology that is kind of going to be played out in the rest of the book. So where there was kind of, for her, kind of barrenness and sadness, there's kind of the reverse of that. We get a bit of a kind of a sneak preview of what's going on in chapters 1 to 3 from that. So we have even Eli, this kind of priest figure who isn't great, and his kind of evil sons. They are the ones who are kind of, you think it's going to maybe be through his line, but it's actually Samuel who's the one who's lifted up. And then in verse 10, the Lord will judge the ends of the earth. He will give strength to his king and exalt the horn of his anointed. So again, we've got the king reference buried in there.
Yeah, absolutely. And that song is so vital because, I mean, actually there's a song at the start of 1 Samuel, there's a song at the end of 2 Samuel, and they kind of bracket the book and give so much of the theology. And as you've rightly said, these reversals and the king being part of that, again, just highlighting God's giving a king is a good thing, always part of his plan. And actually, if we know the New Testament at all, you read this story of this woman who were not expecting to be able to have children for one reason or another, who's then graciously given this unexpected child from the Lord, this child who'll be very significant, and then she sings a song of praise. I mean, this is Mary in Luke's Gospel. And actually, when we get to Luke's Gospel, we'll see so many links back to 1 Samuel. Luke and 1 Samuel have so many little allusions. Even the end of 1 Samuel 2, verse 26, Samuel continued to grow both in stature and favour with the Lord and also with man. Exactly the same thing said about Jesus.
Wow.
And I think we're going to learn about how God works. So much of the story so far has been teaching us of the character of God. So much of the problems, as I think as you draw out so helpfully in the last episode, so many of the problems are when people misunderstand God's character. But the Lord who brings down the high and mighty and the proud, but lifts up the humble. And right at the start of Samuel, we see that. And actually, that's going to be the story of the rest of the book. And I guess we're going to, we come on to Saul and David, who are two rival pictures of potential kings, potential ways of being a king, the Saul way or the David way, and we see how the Lord thinks authority should be used. So I find it a really beautiful picture, obviously pointing to Jesus.
And so helpful. Big appreciation for your notes at thebibleoverbrew.com for that. I would not have seen those reversals. But what are some of the key things we should be seeing as we get into the book?
There's some chapters early on following the arc. I think Saul and David is going to be a key contrast in the book. In chapter 8, the people demand a king. They say, we want a king to be like the other nations. We want someone who will lead us out in battle.
Oh.
Yeah. And we can imagine, I mean, if they say we want a king to lead us out in battle, we can just imagine the sort of king they imagine. And that's the sort of king they get. I think the Lord initially gives them the sort of king that they want, but almost is going to be a negative foil for David who will come. And so there's Saul. He's big, he's strong, he's handsome. I hadn't even noticed until just rereading it. He comes from a wealthy family. He's someone you'd have your eye on. He's someone who, in human terms, he's got it all. He's probably popular. He's just one of the kind of the successful, just he's got it made. He's got everything going for him. he's a head taller than everyone else, I think it says.
Mm.
And that is going to characterize his kingship. um not not so much listening to the Lord as taking things into his own hands. And he really pictures, I think, human authority, or human ways of doing authority, worldly ways of doing kingship, which is thinking the way to succeed is by being the biggest, the strongest, the richest, the best. And we see what a tragedy it is for God's people then to put their trust in such a ruler.
Mm.
I confess, as a church leader, I find this a constant challenge, just thinking, am I aspiring to a Saul kind of leadership? Or when I'm looking, who are we going to look to? Saul surrounded himself, it says somewhere. Any time he saw anyone of particular strength or might, he just brought that person into his gang. Saul was just on the lookout for the strong and surrounded himself with them. But as Jesus says in Mark 10, not so with you. And in Jesus, we see such a different and beautiful picture of what it means to lead.
Mm. Mm. And even we see the Lord's sovereignty over using some lost donkeys to help kind of bring that whole story to be. But yet this is the man who's, when they kind of go to crown him, he's hiding in the baggage. It's a bit of a weird start. You're like, is this God's chosen king? Like, what is going on here? So, okay, we've got Saul in pole position. What do we have going on next?
We see Saul beginning to deliver the people, but we get a couple of moments where actually the our Bibles with the subheadings that, translators put them in, but these are moments where they're helpful, because certainly in my Bible I've got Saul's unlawful sacrifice and then Saul's rash vow. Actually, the little heading there just gives a bit of that's what's going on here. We get one time when the people are being attacked. And normally they wait for Samuel, who's the prophet, to come and make the sacrifice. But Saul decides to take it upon himself, and so he offers this burnt offering. And actually, in ancient Israel, the king and the prophet and then the priest, those roles were kept separate, sort of separation of powers because of human sinfulness. No one human being could hold all three of those. Well, until we get to the New Testament and we find someone who could hold all three of those. But I think partly it was a separation, so the prophets could hold the kings accountable and all the rest of it. So Saul was just not authorized to make these sacrifices, but he decided, you know what? We might say it seemed right in his own eyes. And so he just makes this sacrifice. He then blames Samuel. He says, well, you were late. What was I supposed to do? And we can always hear Samuel saying, well, trust the Lord. So I think we might think, well, making a sacrifice, why is that wrong? But it's taking things into his own hands. And that becomes a bit of a pattern. And then he makes this bizarre vow in chapter 14. The Philistines are the constant enemy throughout the books of Samuel. They're these close neighbors of Israel, constantly attacking. So the Philistines are attacking. So Saul makes this rash vow in chapter 14, verse 24. He says, cursed be anyone who eats any food today while we're battling the Philistines. I mean, it's a bizarre thing to say to your fighting troops. The battle is really tough, so no one's going to eat. But again, it's a sort of taking things into his own hands. And then he says, in fact, anyone who eats is going to die. But you kind of know what's going to happen. In a narrative where someone says something like that, we kind of think, well, clearly someone is going to eat, and probably someone close to you. That's what happens in stories. And it's Jonathan, Saul's son, sees some honey, tastes it. And we have this bizarre moment where Saul says, well, yep, that's it. He's got to die because he broke this command, even though he'd never heard of it. And thankfully the people step in and say, whoa, you can't kill your own son because of this stupid vow that you've made. But I think that moment, the sacrifice, just gives us something into Saul as a kind of take matters into his own hands type person, setting himself up over the people, setting himself up over the Lord even. And so the Lord will say to him, actually, I don't so much demand burnt offerings and sacrifices, but for you to obey me, for you to listen. Chapter 15, I think the voice of the Lord, or listen, comes like 7 times or something. That's Saul's problem. Takes things into his own hands. He doesn't listen to the Lord. His heart isn't obedient to God. So he's very much a negative, I think, by contrast, we'll see David is a different sort of king.
And we get David coming onto the scene as a lowly shepherd boy, and Samuel goes to anoint this son of Jesse, and there he is, and there's the sons, and he's like, not sure if these are the right ones. And then they go and fetch little David out of the fields at the back. Then we get in chapter 17 David and Goliath. I'm so excited about this one. There is one of my favourite songs is Head Crusher by Timothy Brindle from his album The Unfolding, which kind of pulls a lot of these themes through in Christian rap. I'm outing myself as my music taste here. But I was so stoked because you've been saying to look out for serpent-like figures and serpent crusher figures, and we've got one. We've got one. David, this little lad, you think he's not kind of old enough to be the fighting troops, so he's taking food to his brothers who are on the front line fighting the Philistines, and then he ends up in a conversation with Saul. Saul puts him in his armor after agreeing to let him go out and fight Goliath, this massive giant from the Philistines who's their champion. And out David goes, giving up the armor of Saul because it probably didn't fit him. He wasn't used to that. He's familiar with protecting his flock, and so he gets his 5 smooth stones, and in his shepherd's sling he goes out and kind of squares up to Goliath, and then Goliath's like, "What on earth? Who is this weasel that you've sent out to me?" Or I think it says dog. And the battle commences, and David throws a stone at Goliath, who is this giant-like figure and who is wearing armor that has like scales. I think in the original translation that's what drew out in the song for me, that it's like a scaly figure. So you got your serpent vibes, and he throws the stone and hits him in the forehead. I'm hearing head and crushing. Goliath goes down. David cuts off his head, so the serpent figure is deheaded, and then they win the battle with the Philistines, and that's this epic moment that we get our head crusher appearing. But I'm sure there's more things in there that I've not spotted. What else is going on?
Yeah, it's just a brilliant story, isn't it? It's so visual. I mean, so many of these stories are so that looking for the sons. You can imagine sort of this was a sort of a Disney movie.
Yes.
You'd go down the sons from the tallest. Is there anyone else? Well, I mean, there's one, but he's so tiny he didn't even make the lineup.
Yeah.
Okay, we'll have that one, and then now, you've got Goliath, and they sort of had these champions. So sort of rather than all the people fight, it would just be one champion fights for each side, and the champion, whoever's champion wins, that side wins. So that's how this battle is going to come about. But no Israelite dares engage with Goliath until someone says, "Oh, but wait a minute, we've got this DPD driver who just arrived with some cheese. How about the guy who brought the cheese?" Like, I mean, I think we're to go, this is unlikely. This is not the person we've got our eye on, humanly speaking. The cheese delivery guy comes. I think not wearing Saul's armor is interesting. Saul's armor, coat of mail, again, sort of scaly armor. It's quite Goliath-like. Saul's massive, and so this armor doesn't fit David.
Yeah.
And clothing in the Bible often it's more than just clothing. Often it's something about identity. Remember Joseph being clothed in that Technicolor dream coat was not just, "I want you to have a nice coat," but it's, okay, you're the favorite, you're the chosen one. And so here David, he's not gonna fight, he's not gonna win victories like Saul did. He's gonna wear a different sort of armor. And so I think there's something, he's not going to be a Saul-like, Goliath-like king. And I think that serpent crusher thing you said is so helpful, and I think it helps us see this as part of that big story, not so much even little people can do big things, as if the primary message is sort of for us to be like David, but actually what we see is David, this unlikely hero who actually trusts in the Lord. He's the only one who talks about the Lord during the story. All the other soldiers saying he's defying the armies of Israel. David says he's defying the living God. So David trusts God, and he wins the battle on behalf of the people. And that's going to be key. That's what, in this kingship, we're going to be pointed to. The king is going to, in a sense, he's going to represent the people. So if the king is faithful and if the king is good, the people will enjoy blessing. So now it's sort of, in a sense, all the promises and all the hopes that narrowed down to Abraham's family, and now they're narrowing down to the king. If we have a good king, life will be good because he's the representative. What happens to him happens to the people. If he wins a victory, the people win a victory. If he's blessed, the people are blessed. And yeah, we can see where this is going. So we hope we have a good king. That's why, for the people back then, having a good king was so important, because their fate was bound up with the fate of the king. And as Christians, our fate is bound up with the fate of our king. We have a king who defeats our enemies. We have a king who is blessed, and in him we are blessed. And so we start to see this, the king and his people relationship. This David and Goliath story is a beautiful place where that's pictured.
Yeah. And it's cool to land on a David figure when we've kind of seen hints or suggestions of, Jesus type things and questions, but then to be like, aha! In your notes, you'd kind of put together a little list of some of the things that kind of point forwards to Jesus that I found really helpful. Just a couple that really struck me were just, that he was really unexpected as a king. He entrusts himself to God, and he battles with the seed of the serpent. It's this serpent type figure, and we see that again in Jesus so clearly. But yeah, what are your favorite bits that point forward to Jesus?
It's great just having read through the whole thing again. I've never tried to put them all together and just said, okay, if I've just read 1 Samuel and I'm told that the great Messiah to come is going to be like David, what am I expecting? And actually, well, I'm expecting, I mean, David is, he's unexpected. He's not humanly impressive. He's rejected by the powers that be. He challenges the authority figures of his day. Yet, as he suffers, he never sins. We get various moments where it seems that you read the story, David always ends up in a cave with Saul just relieving himself or sleeping or something. David constantly has opportunities to raise his hand against Saul, to kill him, to attack him, but he never does. It really, reading through, reminded me of 1 Peter, where Jesus, he made no threats, but he entrusted himself to him who judges justly. I think we see that here with David. He suffered. He had no place to lay his head. He's on the run. No constant abode. But he did have a few ragtag people around him, and yet he taught them not to. They wanted to kill Saul. But he taught them rather to trust God. I think Psalm 34 is very much a commentary on this particular time. And Psalm 34, where David says, don't do evil, but entrust your way to the Lord. And so we just get a picture of a suffering, righteous, unexpected Messiah. And I just think that is so far from the king who'll bash the Romans with strength that perhaps some in Jesus' day were expecting. But actually, if you read the stories of David, I think we see that he's not a king like Saul. And so what we should be expecting when God sends his king fully and finally in Jesus, we should be expecting a very different kind of king. Hannah's song, a king who might be a humble one who's exalted rather than a mighty proud one. And so I've just really been blown away. We shouldn't be surprised by Jesus and his suffering and how he treats people if we've read these stories. I mean, of course, David will go on to sin. He's not perfect. But there's moments, particularly here, where we see that God's king is very different to the way humans exercise authority. And I think it's a beautiful picture.
I must jump in with my Monday morning moment before I throw it to you. But there is so much here. I feel I haven't seen as clearly the king stuff, so I really appreciated getting that clearer in Overbrew style when there is so much detail here. There's so much going on in the stories, which is great, but it is good to make sure we're keeping the main things the main things. But a small detail that did kind of catch my eyes, stick out for me. 1 Samuel 15, verse 22, this conversation between Samuel and Saul. And Samuel says to Saul, "Does the Lord delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as much as in obeying the Lord? To obey is better than sacrifice, and to heed is better than the fat of rams." And just a little thing for me to think about is we are so blessed to have a Heavenly Father who we can go to any hour of the day or night. And because of Jesus' death and resurrection, we can receive full forgiveness. That is wonderful. But it was a very costly sacrifice. And it was, I think I'm getting a bigger sense of how big it was through what we've been doing. And just not being casual about sin and casual about feeling, oh, well, whatever I'm doing, I can get forgiven. And knowing the freedom and the rest that is in the forgiveness offered through Jesus, but not to be glib or to not be so quick to just know that I can get forgiveness that I don't actually think about what it means to be obedient to the Lord. And I think that word obedience can have, bad connotations and we can think of it negatively. But actually, if we've seen so far that God's way is actually good, and actually it's often us twisting it or a misunderstanding or misapplying or, us thinking that God's out to get us and actually he's not for our good. But actually, if we are there saying what he's got for us is good, his way is a good way to go, then it is a good thing to seek to be obedient to him. Of course, resting in that wonderful forgiveness that is offered, but not getting that around the wrong way. So that's going to be something I'm going to ponder a little more. What about for yourself?
Oh, that's so good. Yeah, I love that. But no, I'm going to stick with the one that I want to piggyback on yours. But the one that struck me was I've just actually turned up 1 Peter 2 and just hearing Peter's words about Jesus, but just seeing how in a sense that they so mirror the experience of David, but of course with Jesus so much further. David didn't suffer and die for his people, but we see a trajectory here, and actually to hear these words from 1 Peter with the David stories in mind, I found again quite moving, thinking of what it cost Jesus. You read the stories of David and just so many exhausting, hard situations, and perhaps just getting a window into not what Christ achieved for us, but also what it cost him to achieve that. So if I just read these verses, I think these are the ones that sort of crystallize all this for me. 1 Peter 2, verse 21 onwards. It says, "Christ suffered for you, leaving an example that you should follow in his steps. He committed no sin. No deceit was found in his mouth. When they hurled their insults at him, he did not retaliate. When he suffered, he made no threats. Instead, he entrusted himself to him who judges justly." And this is where this could only now be Jesus, this next bit. "He himself bore our sins in his body on the cross, so that we might die to sins and live for righteousness. By his wounds you have been healed. For you were like sheep going astray, but now you have returned to the shepherd and overseer of your souls." It's just interesting that the shepherd word there, of course, is pointing back to David as well. And just seeing a beautiful picture what sort of shepherd David was, what sort of shepherd Jesus is, one who would go through such hardship for his people. So yeah, that's something I found very moving.
Thank you. Good stuff. We will be back for our next episode in 2 Samuel with our key chapters 6 to 7, 11 to 12, and 22 to 24. BibleOverbrew.com will have some notes to steer you, things to keep an eye out for. Matt, what's one thing to keep in mind as we read 2 Samuel?
There are so many characters here, so I would encourage you, have a look at the notes. There's a little crib sheet. There's a pink Post-it note being filled out for you with who the main characters are. I get lost very easily with all these different names. So that would be one thing, would be just to have that little crib sheet. So as you read, you've got a sense of why this person's chasing that person and why it matters. And then I think if we remember the land is a new Eden, then sort of are we seeing Eden being fulfilled in any ways in these chapters? There's more than that going on, but I think looking for Eden vibes would be quite a good thing as we read through.
Until next time, it's been great to be with you. We are able to do this thanks to Good News Broadcasting Association, and we'll see you in the next episode. Take care. God bless. Goodbye.
Bye.